Good morning. My name is Randall, and I've been a part of many groups here, but I'm here to represent myself.
Thank you, Mr. Randall. Yes. Sir?
My name is Andrew Smith. I'm here as an Australian citizen to present my point of view, and I'm very grateful for the panel's opportunity and time to listen to what we've got to say.
Thank you. Yes, when you're ready, thank you.
Okay, so the timing is we asked for an hour, but we've got half an hour, minus 10 minutes, so we'll go into it.
No, you'll begin the full half hour.
Full half hour,
yes.
10 minutes of speaking of questions.
You've got half an hour. Go for it.
Thank you. Social licence. I would like to address the panel through the terms of reference with what my understanding of the criteria is for the granting of a social licence. Am I able to give consent, free, prior and informed, to all activities associated with the hydraulic fracturing in the Northern Territory? Free, prior and informed. Thousands upon thousands of words have been written for and against unconventional shale gas hydraulic fracturing, the most complex and extensive hydrogeological assessments through to those who are concerned about their children's children. How can I give consent, free, prior and informed, to a practice that is complex as it is secretive? Free, informed, prior. Social licence-filled experts Ian Thompson and Robert Boutelier have identified three major components that a company must establish to achieve the highest level of social licence: legitimacy, credibility and trust. 1. Legitimacy requires that companies spread awareness, listen to community concerns and follow official and unofficial local norms, customs and practices. 2. Credibility. When a company is regarded as credible, it seems as following through on promises and dealing honestly with everyone. Credibility can be achieved by transparency and consistency in decision-making. 3. Trust is the degree to which the entire public holds collective trust towards an organisation. Companies should strive to achieve full trust from the public in their organisation. As has been said, trust is hard to earn, easy to lose, and very difficult to recover once lost. The gaps in knowledge due to the limited development in Australia of onshore unconventional gas industry is of concern, as is the lack of guarantees in any long-term effects, and including its enormous waste disposal. Yet there is a rush to put thousands of wells in the Northern Territory. Gaps in the knowledge exist, for example, concerning the mobility of organic compounds, heavy metals and radioactive elements during hydraulic stimulation. Similarly, the microbiology occurring deep underground is still largely unknown. Let's look at some statistics. As a stakeholder, I am asked to give consent on behalf of those who cannot speak up and for those who are yet to be born. I will be asked to consent to the removal of vegetation and the establishment of thousands of wells, since unconventional shale reservoirs requires more wells in a shorter time frame, all of which will be taking thousands of megalitres of top quality water. A slick water for extracting the gas, which is comprised of lethal chemicals, some of which if you breathe in will kill you. Many of the chemicals are suspect in causing many illnesses. They can travel through your skin. I will be asked to consent to tonnes of these chemicals in 7 to 18 million litres of water per single fracking operation, which will travel down a complex well with the hopes of mitigation, where possible, around aquifer and groundwater contamination. Does the hydrocarbon industry in Northern Territory have the resources, experience or expertise for monitoring and evaluation of the cement casings and strings needed for the wells, for example? Are there overarching monitoring regulations in place through legislation in the Northern Territory? I will suggest, in fact, it is not possible to reliably predict the release of problematic substances or prevent this by optimising the fracking processes because of many unresolved problems. For example, Appia does not disclose a significant portion of chemicals used in fracking. While these chemicals may only make up 0.1% of the total, there has been a decision secretly to not have to declare them. A sustainable development discourse, the ways in which it specifically defined and maintained a social licence, has not been made explicit. It has been a massive effort on behalf of this industry to overlook criteria because, among many issues, self-interest has dominated. Okay, so ethylene glycol. Origin's energy chemical disclosure submission Amungi Well in the Northern Territory disclosed the following compound among many: J604W, ethylene glycol. It's a cross-linker and is extremely toxic. This chemical must never enter the waterways. And Origin as an example. This is the same company which had to stop their operations of coal seam gas drilling after chemicals were found in the water in Queensland at Miles near Brisbane. Origin admitted they had contaminated the water at the site. When contamination occurred in Queensland, the fracking fluid was supplied by Halliburton and had to Origin's manager, Paul Zealand, has, in brackets, end quotes, a real surprise that BTEX chemicals had turned up. Origin says 20 to 6% of injected simulation is recovered during flowback. Others say it mostly stays in the earth. Contradictions on the most important aspects of potential water contamination, recycling, methane emissions, and number of fracks per well, all of which are of a great concern in our times of rapid climate change. Can I give consent to the hydrocarbon extraction industry? Can I indeed, once the wells have been abandoned and bonds given back, there is nothing in place for perpetual monitoring or the remediation that is going to have to take place forever? Can I give consent to the hydrocarbon extraction industry? No. Thank you.
Yes.
Once again, thank you very much for the time.
Say what I've got to say. Can everybody hear me? Maybe I should just give it to the microphone. I think you probably hear me anyway. While I deal in a fairly cursory manner with the accidents, mayhem and carry on, I think the main point that I'm trying to get across here is to have a sort of a generalised look at the broader financial picture with a view to forming some opinions about what is the value proposition for the average Australian citizen? What's in it for them? And as it seems that the further we get into it, we're confronted here with a sea of relative truths and other things. So basically the idea in terms of the big picture is to be mindful of the quantum field, and of course as many of the panel would know, that you have a classical physics and you have quantum physics, and so I think the idea of an adversarial sort of setup where we listen to people painting other people as some sort of lunatic fringe, and I'm not suggesting that the panel's doing that, but there seems to be this idea that somehow my points are less valid or more valid depending on how good I am at the old school debating trick. So my view on this is that we all have a point of view, and certainly at each moment from the quantum field is a myriad of possibilities, some of which are very strong, some of which are very weak, and as we progress through this, I'm grateful for your consideration. So as we move further into it, when one has a point of view and opinion, the first thing that Appia or Santos does is to try and present alternative facts, which we must be grateful for Mr. Trump for alerting us to these sorts of things. You go and see the spin doctors from Santos and Appia, and they would spin you under the table without you even knowing. So So it was only a week or so ago that I'd been down to the Appia stand here in the Katherine show and have a bit of a chat with the chappies down there, and fired with an evangelical zeal and a bright and shiny countenance as he proceeded to ram the half-chewed chop down my throat is the way I felt, because all I wanted to do was have a talk in general terms about the way things might be or the way things might not be. But unilateral statements like Santos hasn't had a well failure for 50 years, and yet quite clearly they had an 18% stake in Lapindo Brantas in the Sidoarjo province of Indonesia, with the volcano there, the mud volcano, which they claim to deny responsibility for, that they have no responsibility. They say it was seismic activity, and I'll get to the answer for that in a moment. However, a reference in the Geological Society of America's journal, GSA Today, says that it was the failure of Lapindo to install sufficient casing around its gas well, according to the 2007 report in GSA Today. That's the Geological Society of America's journal. Now, they say that they're not responsible for what this did, but as a well-structured company and formerly profitable one, I should say, they obviously had a man on the ground all the time. An 18% stake means they wouldn't leave these fellows to go and do their own thing. And in fact, they say that they had presented regular reports on casings and techniques and strategies to Santos on an ongoing basis, and yet still this accident's happened with dreadful consequences for the people concerned. One of Santos's tricks is that they say, for example, that in relation to coal seam gas, which, as the Dr. Ritchie has pointed out, the main body of this movement is the relationships and connections between people who have had unsavoury experiences and health conditions and other types of things like that. And as a result, that's where the strength lies. There's a general disenchantment and something of a cynicism with a range of organisations who purport to look after our interests. But as we proceed into the numbers, I wonder whose interests they're looking after. So Santos will say that we can't compare coal seam gas to non-conventional hydraulic fracturing. And on a technical level, that may well be the case. However, I think we need to remember the spin and the types of evidence which would provide people in southeast Queensland prior to the commencement of CSG, when in fact they were reassured that it was a very safe industry, that there was no toxic issues, and that chemicals used in the process that you would find under a bathroom sink, although having said that, there's a lot of chemicals under my sink which I really wouldn't want anything to do with myself. So I think the idea that you can't compare coal seam gas and extraction and non-conventional deep shale gas extraction is probably true superficially, but when we look beyond that and say, well, the presentations by various operators were this, and now, with the benefit of hindsight, it is now that, is the thing that we're all concerned about. And this general idea that, for instance, that companies can transfer risk to the general public from themselves is a concern to me, and something that we need to think about in the future, I think. And anyway, we'll get to that in a little bit. So, just to sum up what I was talking about before, that in relation to Santos, the Australian Taxation Office has a very handy list of a number of companies who have not paid tax or who have paid tax. And so when you look through this list of them, I'm not suggesting that they've done anything illegal or that, in fact, that they're avoiding paying tax. But if they're acting in my interests collectively in terms of getting me the best value for money they can out of a resource which we all own, which is the Commonwealth, then what is the benefit to me of a company that doesn't pay tax? I think that's it's a great legal option that they have, where they don't pay tax. For a whole variety of reasons, some of which we'll get to in a moment. But it seems to me that when we look at this whole process of what the numbers are, that there's an awful lot that is not generally known. For example, in Canada, companies over there are not allowed to export gas unless they can prove that there is a surplus of gas in the domestic economy. Now, it seems to me that some of the benefits of an approach like this in Australia, which when we compare Canada with Australia are very broadly similar, has some benefits for a value proposition for me. So, in relation to tax, I'd just like to reassure everybody that I'm not suggesting that companies are illegally shirking their responsibilities or that by avoiding tax, but then when we look at some of the cosy relationships that they've had with government further on down the track, I still wonder whose interests they're acting in. So, when I'm waiting to hear what Santos says when I'm wrong and I'm drowning under a blizzard of numbers, because that's usually what people in these circumstances do, they have well-rehearsed lines which, if what I'm saying is propaganda, then I'm a very poor student. However, from the Santos point of view, there's a number of well-rehearsed lines, happier I should say, and let's just acknowledge Martin Ferguson's contribution to Strine in Australia. I think that it's widely, very little known that he introduced the term the bomb lion to Australian vernacular, and for that I'm very grateful. 10 minutes to go. Christ almighty. Thank you so much. Okay, value for money for the economy and the long-suffering taxpayer. Accidents and mistakes will happen. Drilling wells, any wells, is a risky business with a long legacy tail. How many disasters are acceptable? For instance, in terms of fatalities on the road, is there a point where there is an acceptable number of fatalities? For instance, in New South Wales, they've got fatalities down there to the same level that they have in 1927. Practically, as a realistic community, are we happy with zero fatalities in New South Wales? Is that what we're hoping to do? And similarly, in this industry, what is our acceptable level of risk in relation to future generations and in an environment like ours with very little in the way of water? It seems to me that the notion that there could be problems later on is a big issue for me. So, what is the form guide? And based on a Melbourne Cup form guide, would we be backing it? Well, let's find out. Drilling wells, any wells, is a risky business with a long legacy tail. How many disasters are acceptable? Who will be liable in the future for screw-ups that may take decades or more to manifest? And certainly the history of legacy mines in the Northern Territory would seem to suggest that the long-suffering taxpayer is going to pick up the tab for that. Hydraulically fractured wells in 2011, 2012 have failed in the Northern Territory. That was Petro Frontier. They had 3 wells, 1 shallow casing failure, 2 wells that were drilled into faults, communicated with a highly permeable water source and produced biogenic hydrogen sulfide, and all 3 have been abandoned. And yet the chappie from Santos says that there hasn't been a hydraulic well failure in the Northern Territory, and so there's a credibility gap there in terms of the social licence. There has to be value for money for the taxpayer and the owners of the resource, which is all of us here in this room. Who will be liable for issues in the future? And can we stop the shifting of risk from companies and onto the public? For example, we're all familiar, I think, with the Irish bank, the Anglo-Irish bank, where the Irish government guaranteed the bank and then found out about a huge black hole in the background, and the Irish people are still paying for it, of course. I think that metaphor in relation to companies in Australia is really very apt. Are there benefits from giving companies our minerals, oil and gas, the Commonwealth, when they don't pay any tax or minimal tax? What is the value proposition for me as a tax-paying citizen? I don't have access to these sort of things that they do. I still pay taxes, and I expect that everybody else in Australia will too. So the background to this is a control of people through resources, allied with a shifting of risk from companies and onto citizens, taxpayers of Australia. After years of waffling, I'm going to give an example here. Malaysia's state-owned Petronas has thrown in the towel on its Canadian Northwest LNG project due to the dismal economics facing global LNG. A glut of world suppliers and stagnant demand have driven prices well below break-even price for construction and operating the enormous facilities required to process and liquefy and ship the gas. Company Spin says it was because of Canada's anti-business policy climate. They say it's because of Canada's high taxes, carbon taxes, interminable environmental reviews, and Indigenous land claims. Surprisingly, a left-wing government in British Columbia, in power for only a week, was a major contributor as well. We should be collectively grateful for an opportunity to reflect on the circumstances which has led to this point, because Australia has far less onerous regulatory constraints, and the Northern Territory is no exception. When gas moved from $15 per million British thermal unit in 2009 and 2012, Australian companies moved quickly. Several huge LNG projects were built: Gorgon, Curtis Island and Ichthys, almost simultaneously aiming to cash in on the premium Asian prices. Environmental and fiscal hurdles were modest, and Indigenous populations in Australia have little leverage to negotiate, depending on where they are. A new right-wing government sweetened the pot by cancelling a modest carbon tax in 2014. So it was a hammer and tongs madcap adventure where almost $200 billion was spent on LNG projects over the next few years. In Queensland, 3 massive plants were built by Bechtel at the same time and on the same island. The impact of this hijinks on the construction costs was enormous and could have been reasonably foreseen. Chevron's Gorgon plant cost over $72 billion and almost 50% over budget. So imagine the recriminations if it was the Northern Territory Department of Housing or the Commonwealth Government that had an overrun like this. We'd have their guts for garters. A triumph for free market efficiency? Come on now. After construction started, Asian gas prices fell by 2/3, hemorrhaging red ink. Write-downs already exceed $10 billion for the Queensland LNG plants. Former boomtowns suffer a major hangover, including collapsed house prices, and Gladstone's no exception. Every Australian consumer pays for this miscalculation, and unlike Canada, gas exporters don't have to prove that gas exports are surplus to domestic needs. The cost of domestic gas more than doubled with the diversion of so much gas to export. Electricity prices have gone ballistic due to the use of gas for quick response times during electricity production during peak times. The government and Australian people are not reaping any benefits, since the royalty deals inked to accelerate LNG projects mean there will be no royalty income until capital investments are paid off. That will more than likely never happen. Therefore, we have given this gas away to Asian people, many of whom pay less for it than we do. An unseemly headlong helter-skelter rush into the projects meant there was insufficient time for proper reflection, checks and balances, which is part of what this inquiry is about. Clearly, more time needs to be spent assessing costs and benefits of these projects. These resources will still be there in the future, so just waiting some time, a long time preferably, is not really an issue. And what is the benefit of haste for the Australian citizen and taxpayer in this? Nothing, plus high potential for an environmental disaster, and act in haste, repent at leisure. How are gas projects taxed? The petroleum resource tax is a profits-based tax levied over a specified threshold and generated from the sale of petroleum commodities such as natural gas and oil that excludes LNG. From 2012, it was extended to include all onshore and offshore oil and gas projects from Northwest Shelf and coal seam gas. So, in a nutshell, these fellows get to they get to deduct the receipts from gas sales from the cost of the asset, the building of the asset. In Gorgon's case, $72 billion. And they can carry forward this amount year on year, 18% compounded. So we don't have to be mathematicians to work out that there's going to be very, very little in it for us, if they ever pay any tax at all. It's up here when people are looking for jobs over in Gorgon. You could go to the website 2 or 3 years ago, and if you could look after a team of fellas and you had a trade, they were offering $330,000 per annum, and if you could stick it out for 3 years, they give you another $150,000 as a bonus. It's not hard to see where the money went. So how much does the government collect? I've got a table here on the paper which I've given you, and the source is from the Australian Taxation Office. Okay, so basically these deals are comparatively with Qatar, which I think is public knowledge, that the idea that $26 billion in receipts for the government of Qatar based on their interest in gas exports compared to our rather paltry $800 million, I get back to what is the value proposition for me as a citizen of Australia. But what are other companies' contribution to this value proposition? It doesn't worry me whether they're not paying any tax and doing it legally. The fact is they're not paying any tax, and as a taxpayer, I resent it. We all want services here, and I'm not afraid of paying for them. So I want to see people paying for what they're doing. I don't want to see people shirking their responsibilities and being rebated for royalties as they do in the Northern Territory, having unlimited access to the water which they do in the Northern Territory. So the low petroleum resource rent tax collection suggests there are only marginal benefits from the current LNG boom for the wider community as Commonwealth royalties are collected and redistributed Australia-wide. However, Queensland royalties collected from coal seam gas projects are only distributed within the state. So let's look at this table here. In 2012-2013, the federal royalties was $5,798,614,359, and we can see that as we move forward to 2014-15, that the numbers drop. So the state governments, they've correspondingly increased. My point here is that in terms of the overall scheme of things and looking at the expenditure of these gas people and whatnot, $200 billion, these receipts are very, very little. So in terms of the petroleum resources rent tax for 2013 through 2014, and sourced again, I'd say from the, I'm telling you from the ATO, we can see that expenditure that in excess of sales, that is accessible receipts, can be carried over year by year plus interest at 18%. The table below depicts sales receipts of more than $25 billion in 2014-15, but only $1.2 billion was paid in resource rent tax. So there's a problem with that now, and my view on it is that the value proposition for the Australian citizen needs to be better than that. Okay, so you can look at these facts and figures to your heart's content later on, but I'm mindful that there's only 5 minutes to go. So, 2, the gas price plays a vital role in assessing a business's liability for petroleum resource rent tax. That is because gas value minus expenditure is subject to the petroleum resource rent tax. As there is no Australia-wide hub for gas that can help determine a fair price, a transfer price needs to be calculated for the cost of gas that is used to make LNG. So transfer pricing of the petroleum resource rent tax is covered by regulations of gas transfer price methodology. This is used to calculate the transfer price of gas, but the various creative interpretations by business of the method are seen as contentious. That means they're not transparent. Back to our social licence again. The fairness of the regulation process should be debated more openly, and it's not, as it's currently debated only among companies, tax advisors and the ATO. Chevron, major oil and gas company, failed to defend its profit shifting, which minimises company tax in the Australian courts, and they've had to cough up a few more bucks. Thank God for the long-suffering taxpayer. Surely this lack of revenue from the petroleum resource rent tax raises a few questions for the government and the rest of the long-suffering Australian taxpayers and citizens. There has been recent commentary about a resource rent tax versus a royalty. It's time for a review of taxing LNG at a time when Qatar enjoys tax income $26 billion for an equivalent amount of gas that we get here in Australia. So that pretty well concludes it for me. There's a bit of information there which you can read at your leisure, and I think everybody's got a copy. So once again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate that you've come here to listen to us and that you're happy to take into account the concerns of an average Australian citizen. So thank you very much to the panel.
Thank you. And I don't think there's any such thing as an average Australian citizen. Just I guess a couple of, one was a request. You've in both of your detailed papers and presentations, there's a lot of figures there and facts, but they're not referenced in any way. If we could in due course have the references that you use to construct the tables and the facts and figures, we'd be very grateful.
Are you referring to mine or to hers?
Both. Both. There are facts and figures in both.
From the ATO. Would you like a screen dump or something like that?
No. So you've taken your figures only from the ATO?
Only from the ATO.
Okay, no, that's all right.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's necessarily the case, obviously, in relation to yours, Ms. Randall. There's claims there as well that are not sourced by any facts, and we would, or sorry, rather there are facts that aren't sourced by any references, and we would certainly appreciate those. For example, you've given a quote in relation to Origin's manager, Paul Zeeland. You've also given some facts about, again, claims that Origins have made.
We can provide those.
Excellent. They'd be very useful. They'd be very, very useful.
Yeah, thank you.
sometimes it's the case that people have managed to get their hands on information material that we haven't or can't.
Yeah.
So we'd be very grateful for those. Thank you. I should just say that you are only given half an hour because we're oversubscribed in Katherine. So we've had lots of demand, which is great. That's we had to limit people. I've got a question for you, though, Mr. Randall. You said you posed yourself a sort of a rhetorical question: can I give consent to hydrocarbon extraction industry, to the hydrocarbon extraction industry? No. Is that any hydrocarbon extraction industry, or was that comment really specifically to?
Because of gas and oil, it's the whole of the industry. But here I am looking at shale gas in the Northern Territory.
But your comment was in relation to the whole industry, oil and gas.
In that I need to know more about the extraction, about the business itself. I can't just blindly say, yes, great to oil, great to gas, great to anything. I just have to have more information about what's happening here.
So would your preference be that in the absence of that information that all oil and gas industry shuts down?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. It is the methodology. It's the way they engage with general communities. It's the way they move into particular communities and have a certain spin. And I've come to that conclusion as someone who wanted to describe the social licence, someone who's lost a lot of trust in these industries.
No, thank you. Yes. I'll start with we'll work our way up. Dr. Anderson, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Ms. Randall, I've got a question about the social licence, which is obviously a really important point. And we've just heard from Ms. Cummings a presentation in which she talks about a lack of relationship between social licence and facts or evidence, as she put it. She gave an example of the pastoral industry doesn't employ many people relatively, is a dangerous workplace, causes considerable environmental damage, yet has a very, very strong social licence, and which is very true. And if I could sort of read from your presentation, I'll be asked to consent to the removal of vegetation, taking of thousands of megalitres of top quality water, which is what the pastoral industry does. And you could also add that the pastoral industry is a major emitter of methane. And so, but despite all those things, there's still a very, very strong social licence for pastoralism. So I guess my question is, in your view, what is it, why has something like the pastoral industry got such a strong social licence despite these issues, whereas something like the potential shale gas industry is total reverse in terms of social licence?
I think because the hydraulic shale gas extraction business cannot give any long-term guarantees. And to give a social licence, you have to give guarantees. We do not know what's going to happen with the amount of slick water, fluid that's coming out of this very complex industry. Where it's being taken, where it's going, the general hydrology, the science of it is very, very worrying. And there's no one giving me promises or guarantees for what's going to happen to the long term. When they get, when they put a plug in these, I'm relying on a plug to put into this incredible long cement thing that's going down kilometres and hoping for the best. That is not guaranteed. I don't have those kind of questions around the pastoral industry. I can see, yes, that does produce a lot of methane, but I don't have a lot of other questions around what it's actually, how it's impacting beneath the earth, above the earth, surface water, groundwater, the aquifers in Northern Territory. No one understands the aquifers of the Northern Territory. And you're putting an industry in here that has very little indifference to some of these issues. We have thousands of reports over thousands of years, thousands of reports over many, many decades on water quality, water monitoring, and yet this can just go in here and decide that we're going to extract this much water and change the whole depth. You can't take something out and not change the geology. And what are we putting back in, and where are we going to store it? There is just so many questions, and there's no guarantees, and no one can give you a guarantee. And that's what a social licence stands for.
Could I just add, though, that it's well known that the pastoral industry has a lot of difficulties environmentally, and certainly if you were to read Augustus Gregory's Journal of an Expedition to Northern Australia, you can make pretty good comparisons with what the riverbeds were like in those days, in 1856 in fact, comparatively with what they are now, and that the rise of woody weeds and things like that, I think their time will come. I also think that the returns, the average return on your investment for averaged over 30 years for a Northern Territory cattle station, we tend to think that it's going to be a lot of money, but in fact it's 3%. So, there's a lot of damage being done in that industry for sure, and there's a lot of land tied up by some very few people, companies and all the rest of it. I certainly would like to acknowledge what you're saying there. Absolutely, you're right.
Yes, Professor Hart.
Mr. Randall, could I just, following on from Justice Pepper about evidence, you've made a number of statements there that I'd like some evidence and some references. For example, you said top quality water. What's your basis for that statement?
It's through a lot of my readings, because of the chemical, we have chemicals and a lot of stimulation under pressure, under heat,
Sure.
incredible pressure. And there's very little known about some of those particular reactions. And in a lot of my readings I've read, and I can give you the reference, top quality water is preferable because, again, water has incredible many chemicals in itself. So, again, you've got these chemical reactions. So top quality water is for the first lot of fracking. I'm not talking about...
Okay, so you're talking about the aquifer, the groundwater that they're potentially going to access.
Yes.
For the fracking. Well, I'd be interested because I don't think anyone, knowing the quality, the range of quality of the Cambrian limestone aquifer, would say it's top quality. Depends a little on what you mean. Mm-hmm. But it's in many cases it's okay for cattle. It's probably a bit dicey for irrigation. And certainly we wouldn't want to be drinking it. So I just, if you can justify that a little bit better, that would be great. The other one was I was a bit surprised, I suppose, why you picked out ethylene glycol from Origin's.
Yeah. And this is thank you. This is again the issues around clear knowledge, information, and understandings and angles and perspectives of everyone that comes here. So you're looking at your chemistry, your biologists, your geologists, everyone's going to say to you, oh, this is just something that you can put through in your coolant in your car, for example. Sure. So everyone's got a way of diminishing the concern around any chemical. And this is a chemical that I've come into research that it is a very toxic chemical. And it's something that you don't want to be putting in the water, let alone the risk of it going through. You can't control where water goes. We're seeing that problem in Katherine with the PFAS contamination. You have plumes, you have these particular compounds that don't break down. And so I'm seeing it as a far more serious chemical than just something that you put in the coolant or whatever.
Yeah, I think you better do a little bit more research on that particular chemical.
J604.
But I think your general perspective of transparency from the companies in terms of what chemicals they're using and what chemicals are coming back from the flowback fluid is genuine, and we're certainly doing all we can to work those out. But I don't think I could accept your statement that ethylene glycol is extremely toxic. Yes, it is toxic, but it is used it's used in runways and aircraft as an antifreeze. So overseas, it gets into lots and lots of waterways. It breaks down in a couple of weeks. So I just caution against the terminology. We're into the evidence game, and we need to justify everything that we say. Yep.
Professor Priestley. Sorry, did you wish to say something?
I'm happy to provide that information.
Excellent. That would be very useful. Yes, Professor Priestley.
Yeah, I guess following up on that particular issue, we've certainly heard in a lot of consultations this issue of the toxicity of chemicals that are used in these processes. Toxicity is a very relative term. I'm not sure whether you're prepared to accept the basic concept of toxicology, that the risk of producing adverse effects is very much related to the dose or level of exposure. So for a very toxic chemical, a low exposure might cause harm. For a relatively non-toxic chemical, you'd require a much higher level of exposure. But for any toxic chemical, even a very toxic one, there will be a level of exposure at which there should be no adverse effect on human health. I'm wondering if you are prepared to accept that particular concept.
I think that's where, again, the defining of the social licence. And as we sit here, as what Andrew said, is 1 or 2 accidents on the road acceptable? Is this amount of toxicity acceptable? What is the effects of the accumulation of chemicals in our environment? What is the background of what we're all experiencing? We have a lot of illness in Katherine. We have significant cancers that are arriving. We've got some strange deformities at the hospital. It's not propaganda. It's not crazy stuff. It's what are we prepared to live with? Are we happy that we've got PFAS in our chemicals, in our water here? Are we going to be happy with this extra amount of thousands of gallons, litres of chemicals that are going into this industry? It's an invasive industry. We don't know much about the long-term chemical combinations and how these things begin to accumulate and how things react.
Yes, last question from Dr. Beck.
So, Mr. Smith, thank you very much for your detailed collation of information and commentary, particularly on the taxes. I'd just like to pursue one matter that you raised towards the end. In terms of, you know, there are problems with the petroleum resource rent tax and also associated with the transfer pricing mechanism. And then you say, looking at the resource rent tax versus a royalty. I'm just wondering, can you elaborate as to how you see a better outcome being derived in the future and try to balance those two, or even introducing something additional?
Probably the petroleum resource rent tax was probably seemed like a good idea at the time, and then as it unfolded, there were problems. And in terms of the simplicity, in terms of administration and things like that,
I would suggest that royalty payments of some sort or another are probably a better way to go. It's certainly, I mean, with the idea that possibly gas companies are doing their own metering in terms of volumes and stuff like that, it's a worry to me that foxes are looking after hen houses and things like that. I mean, I personally, I'm not too sure how you would police or administer these things. I'm a taxpayer basically, and I have obviously, as you could imagine, a keen interest in seeing other people paying their share of what is in fact the Commonwealth. Now, it might be that there is a better method other than a royalty and other than a petroleum resource rent tax, and possibly it's a matter that collegially people like yourself, who obviously have a great deal of expertise, can come up with a better model, and that it may well be that a better model exists. And this is not a perfect science, so I've done the best I can with information that I have available to me, and it's available publicly on the public record. But I'm happy to acknowledge that it's not a perfect science. And so to that extent, it may well be that you might have recommendations or ideas of your own based on information that you've also heard here. Certainly I'm interested in the idea that there needs to be more talk about it, generally. More discussion, because I think that people, generally speaking, are very ill-informed in terms of what the overall economic picture is, what's in it for you and me, how does this whole thing work. And so in terms of whether there's issues with chemicals, whether there's issues with environmental things, these are all valid things. But at the end of the day, we're all part of a country here, and we'd all have an interest in better hospitals and better policing and hopefully better government.
Thank you. We'll leave it on that, I think, very apt observation. Thank you both for coming today, presenting material, preparing papers. You put in an enormous amount of effort, and we're very grateful. Thank you very much. We look forward to those references in due course. Thank you.